I'm Renee Aziz, Director of Educational Partnerships at Virtuoso Education Consulting. Thanks for the introduction, Kristen, and the opportunity to briefly highlight some important information about the impact of implicit biases on educational outcomes. I believe this is an essential area that we need to focus on as educators if we are to really achieve our goals related to equity. Let's start with defining what we mean by bias. Biases can be defined as a tendency, inclination, prejudice, or preference for or against someone or something. While the focus of this short share is on unconscious or implicit biases, it's important to state that biases can be both conscious and unconscious. Both types shape how we think, how we behave, and the decisions we make. In everyday language, you can think of biases as the stories that we have about people and things before we experience them personally. Biases are those unconscious associations that we make even without knowing it. And one of the most important things to remember about bias is that we all have biases. No one is immune. Now, you might be wondering how biases occur. Well, our biases are triggered automatically as a function of the emotional centers in our brains. These automatic responses are the result of mental models or schemas that we have stored in our memories to help us interpret familiar and unfamiliar situations. Schemas are often helpful because they allow us to understand situations that we may have never personally experienced. However, if our schemas or stories are biased, they can negatively impact our perceptions and behavior. Biases typically impact us in three contexts. Being aware of these situations is an important part of the awareness we need to monitor the impact of our biases. So let's talk briefly about these three contexts. Implicit biases are frequently triggered in ambiguous situations where there's a level of uncertainty. In these situations, we rely on those schemas to help us make sense of the situation. Another context that increases the likelihood that biases will be activated are those situations where we have to make a snap, in-the-moment decision. These situations are ones that we don't have a lot of time to gather information or even intentionally consider all of the evidence that we have. Finally, situations where we might experience culturally mediated differences related to patterns of communication and behavior represent the third context where our biases can be activated. Now, as you reflect on these situations, I hope you're making connections about how easy it is for us to find ourselves in situations where we experience these three contexts often in both our personal and professional lives. As we dig a little deeper, I also believe it is important for us to understand the factors that can influence the existence of implicit biases in our educational settings. The research in this area indicates that if we hold stereotypes about specific cultural groups, if we engage in culturally deficient thinking, if we have limited knowledge about cultural communication styles, or if we are unable to make meaningful connections with students who may have cultures that are different than our own, it's these conditions that increase the prevalence that the implicit biases that we hold will impact academic, behavioral, and social outcomes for our students. As educators, we must make sure that our lenses are clear. So how do we do that? The great news is that there is an abundance of evidence that indicates that we can change our level of bias. Dr. Patricia Devine states that we should think of implicit biases as habits. Practicing specific strategies focused on reducing these biases will help us break the bias habit. So as we begin to conclude, this edition of Short Shares are really focused on providing practical tips that we can implement in our settings. The tool that I've prepared for you is a debiasing strategy tic-tac-toe board that highlights 9 debiasing interventions that will help you increase your awareness of bias and get you started on strategies to reduce them. Notice the green center square? I encourage all of you to begin here by taking the Implicit Association Test, or IAT. There are many different types of IATs that you can take, but I encourage you all to take the one on race as you begin your journey to become more aware of implicit biases that you hold. And I'd like to end with this quote. The challenge of bias is one of people who believe in equality, but who act in ways that perpetuate bias and inequality. So my challenge to you, colleagues, is to start the journey to address biases. The benefits of doing so on your life and the lives of the students you support will be vast. Thank you for listening.